Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so after a small break of some sort, we'll be resuming, inshallah. Um, as you all know, we are reading through Ibn Qayyim's Madārij al Sālikīn. So for those who are joining us for the first time, this is, I think, our 8th or 9th session, and we're reading from Madārij al Sālikīn of Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah. We're taking different excerpts and different sections from the book, and the duration of this class will continue as long as there is a lockdown and the masajid are closed. Once the masajid reopen, then inshallah we will be resuming our weekly tafsir class in the Najashi Mosque in London, inshallah. So we'll start reading, inshallah.
Sorry, Sheikh Alamgir, before we start, if you look at the chat facility, there seems to be you can't communicate with everyone. All of them are privately to you. So I don't know if you've done that deliberately.
Oh no, I haven't.
Answer other people's questions.
Right.
I don't know if you can see what I've sent you.
Yeah, you sent me a private. It says privately. I don't know why. I didn't change any settings. I don't know why that's doing that. One second, let's have a look. Allow participants to chat, rename themselves. I can't explain that. I don't know why that's happened. It might be because of the Zoom update. That's true. Yeah, so there was a Zoom update, but that Zoom update was end of May, wasn't it? 30th of May, wasn't it? So, yeah, I mean, was there another one today? Oh, okay. Oh, so it must be although I didn't update mine. Yeah, I mean, it's not a major issue for today. I'll have to look into it. I can't do it now. But I can see your messages. Okay, so if you send me messages, just make sure you send it to the co-host account, inshallah. Right. Did anyone have any problems logging on today? There's someone. Yeah, this is odd. I don't know why I have two co-host accounts open. This happened yesterday. Because I'm only logged in on two devices, so I don't know where the third person is. Who the third person is? Yeah, I mean, I've got 3 accounts open. There's only 2. I mean, I've only got 2. This is quite odd. Okay, I don't know what Zoom are doing. Who is the other co-host? That's definitely not me. Anyway, okay. Well, if someone is spying on us, then inshallah, hope they benefit. Right, okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, the section of Rida. Now, in order for us just to we'll just do a quick overview of what we've looked at in the first few weeks. And the way we'll do that is by just looking at the matan itself. So, we'll be looking at the text itself, Imam al-Harawi's text on Rida. And we'll just summarize it through his words, inshallah. So, Bab al-Rida, he goes on to mention very quickly that I'll just mention highlight the important part. So he said this is Rida is from the stations which are in contentment, min awwali masalik ahli al-khusus wa ashaqqiha ala al-amma. It's from the first sort of steps to sort of traversing the path of the elite worshippers, and it's one of the most difficult for lay people. وهو على 3 درجات, and this is رضا is of 3 levels. الدرجة الأولى, the first level, which is رضا العامة, which is the contentment you find amongst lay people. وهو الرضا بالله ربا, and that is to be content and pleased with Allah being your Lord. بسخط عبادة ما دونه, and to essentially show resentment towards anything else that is worshipped besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the worshipping of other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the basic level, and that's where the religion revolves around that particular pillar, to be pleased with Allah's being your Lord. وهو يطهر من الشرك الأكبر, it cleanses one from the major shirk. And that can only occur, a person can only reach that level of rida, of being pleased with Allah as your Lord, is if you fulfill these 3 conditions. أن يكون الله عز وجل أحب الأشياء إلى العبد, is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beloved thing to a servant. وأولى الأشياء بالتعظيم, and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes more deserving to you of your ta'zim, of your veneration and reverence. وأحق الأشياء بالطاعة, and that He is most entitled to obedience and being obeyed. If you fulfill these 3 conditions, then you are truly content with Allah as being your Lord. The second level, والدرجة الثانية, الدرجة الثانية, the second level, so this is a slightly higher level in the eyes of Imam al-Harawi. الرضا عن الله, it's to be pleased and content with Allah, meaning being pleased with what He decrees for you, being content with what He decrees for you. وبهذا الرضا نطقت آية التنزيل, نطقت آيات التنزيل. This is the rida that Allah speaks about in the Quran. For example, يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. The ayahs that speak about the servants being pleased with Allah and Allah being pleased with them. Now, there are a couple of issues here that Ibn Qayyim had an issue with. Firstly, he didn't agree with Imam al-Harawi that this form of contentment is higher than the first level of contentment. So for him, Ibn Qayyim, the highest level of contentment is to be pleased with what Allah has decreed. The highest level of contentment is to be pleased with Allah as a Rabb. For that necessitates being pleased with what He decrees. And that was the position of Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah. وهو الرضا عنه في كل ما قضى, and that is to be content with everything that He decrees. So you're content with this action of Allah of decreeing whatever He decrees for you. وهذا من أوائل مسالك أهل الخصوص, and this is from the sort of first stages again of traversing this path of the elite. And this can only be ويصح بثلاثة شرائط. This is what we're going to be looking at this. Okay, so yeah, this is what we're going to be looking at, inshallah, this area here. وهو يصح أن يكون وبهذا الرضا نطقت آية التنزيل. That's what we'll be looking at from today, inshallah. So he says, the author rahimahullah, إذا عرف هذا or إذا عرف هذا فلنرجع إلى شرح كلامه. So if this is all, this is obviously based on what he mentioned in the last lesson. إذا عرف هذا, so if this is now known, and he was mainly speaking about his personal opinion that رضا بالله is of a higher level than رضا عن الله. Being pleased with Allah as your Lord, that is of a higher degree than simply being pleased with what He decrees for you. فلنرجع, so let us return to explaining his words, meaning the words of Imam al-Harawi. قال وبهذا الرضا نطقت تنزيل. And in our print it said نطقت آية التنزيل. So this is the rida that the Tanzil speaks of. The Tanzil is in reference to the Quran. تنزيل من رب الرحيم. So this is a revelation, as we know. So Tanzil is something that's been revealed. So this is the Rida that the revelation speaks of. And so he explains this by saying يشير إلى قوله عز وجل, and so he's pointing to the likes of the verse such as قال الله هذا يوم ينفع الصادقين صدقهم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, this is a day in which the Sadiqeen will benefit from their truthfulness. They will have لهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا. They will have gardens underneath which rivers flow. They will reside there. They will reside therein for eternity. رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه. Allah is pleased with them, and they are pleased with Him. ذلك الفوز العظيم. That is the supreme success. That is the supreme success. When Allah is pleased with you, and you are pleased with Allah. That's the type of rida that Allah speaks. Now, Ibn Qayyim, when obviously he mentioned that these verses that speak about Allah's ridwan, Allah's pleasure, and people being pleased with Allah, that is something that actually will occur. What seems to be evident, especially if you look at the tafsir, this is something that will occur in the afterlife. This type of rida, not necessarily in this life, of that degree anyway. وقال تعالى, Allah also says, لا تجد قوما يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر يوادون من حاد الله ورسوله ولو كانوا آباءهم أو أبناءهم أو إخوانهم أو عشيرتهم أولئك كتب في قلوبهم الإيمان وأيدهم بروح منه ويدخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه. That you will not find a believing people, or you will not find a people who believe in Allah and the last day, showing kindness towards those who strive against Allah, or those who show enmity towards Allah and His Messenger, even if they were to be their fathers, their sons, their brothers, or their family. These are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has inscribed faith into their hearts, and He has supported them from the Spirit, from Him, meaning Jibreel, and He will enter them into paradise, underneath which rivers flow, therein to reside for eternity. Allah is pleased with them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them, وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ, and they are pleased with Him. So there are many verses like this. وقال تعالى, and another verse, جزاؤهم عند ربهم جنات عدن تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه ذلك لمن خشي ربه. So their reward, I mean the believers, they will have from their Lord, they will have gardens, or the Jannat Aden, underneath which rivers flow. Allah will be pleased with them, and they will be pleased with Allah. ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ خَشِيَ رَبَّهِ. That will be for those who have awe of their Lord, those who have khashya of their Lord. So he says, فَتَضَمَّنَتْ هَذِهِ الْآيَاتِ جَزَاءَهُمْ عَلَى صِدْقِهِمْ وَإِيمَانِهِمْ. These verses indicate or point to their reward, the reward that they will receive in the afterlife for their truthfulness and for their iman. وَأَعْمَالَهُمْ الصَّالِحَةِ, and their good deeds. وَمُجَاهَدَةَ أَعْدَائِهِ, and them striving against his enemies. وعدم ولايتهم وعدم وأعمالهم الصالحة ومجاهدة أعدائه وعدم ولايتهم, and for them not taking them as allies. So the reward for all of that Allah بأن رضي الله عنهم فأرضاهم, Allah will be pleased with them, and so He will make them content, He will make them pleased, and so as a result فَرَضُوا عَنْهُ, and so they will be pleased with Allah. وإنما حصل لهم هذا بعد الرضا به ربا وبمحمد نبيا وبالإسلام دينا. So this will only occur after them being pleased with Allah as their Lord, and Muhammad ﷺ as their messenger, and Islam as their religion. Okay, now that's the approach of Imam al-Harawi, and that's how he would be using verses like this. Although, as we said, that perhaps these verses are probably maybe the context of this verse is not that appropriate for the point that is trying to be made, but nonetheless this was his view, Imam al-Harawi's view. وقوله وهو الرضا عنه في كل ما قضى. And this second level, just to make sure to distinguish it from the first level. So the first level is to be pleased with Allah as your Lord, that you are happy that Allah created you, He nurtures you, He sustains you, He takes care of your affairs. To be pleased with Allah as your Lord, to be pleased with Islam as your religion, that you're happy being a Muslim and you find contentment in Islam, then that's the first level. This level, وَهُوَ الرِّضَى عَنْهُ فِي كُلِّ مَا قَضَى. It is to be content and pleased with everything that He decrees. With everything that He decrees. So he says, هُنَا ثَلَاثَةُ أُمُورٍ. So here there are three things. الرِّضَى بِاللَّهِ, to be pleased with Allah. وَالرِّضَى عَنِ اللَّهِ, to be pleased with what Allah decrees. To be pleased with His decreeing. Okay. Someone's unmuted themselves. Not working. I can't. There you go. All right. Okay, so just be careful not to unmute yourselves. Okay. So what's the difference? So this is essentially the second level, الرضا عن الله, for when He decrees things that you are content with Him. والرضا بقضاء الله, and being pleased with the actual decree of Allah. And that's a very subtle difference between the two. What's the difference between الرضا عن الله and رضا بالله? And this is actually a bit contentious as well from a theological perspective. Is there a difference between what He decrees and the decree itself? So, for example, okay, there is a difference. This is what Ibn Qayyim will argue, that when it comes to Allah decreeing something, there's a process of decreeing. That is the al-qada. That's the process of decreeing. And the actual maqdi, or the thing that actually has been decreed, that's a separate thing. So for example, if Allah decrees death, now when He decrees that somebody dies, there are two things here. So there's the decree itself, meaning the fact that Allah has decided and destined that this person dies at this particular time, and then the death itself. That's what is biqada'illah, meaning bil maqdi, what we'll say bil maqdi or bil maqdur, what has been decreed. So they're two different things. And people can respond to them in different ways. So some people can be pleased with his action of decreeing death, but he might not show contentment towards the death itself. Right? And this is something that not all scholars agree with. Okay, but this will become clearer, inshallah. Which one is which? So ar-rida anillah is referring to His actions, meaning the act of Allah decreeing. Okay, and ar-rida bi qada'illah refers to basically al-maqdi, meaning being content with the actual decree itself. So if it's death, for example, then you're content with that person dying. Okay. So this will become clearer, inshallah. He will explain this in a bit more detail, inshallah. Yeah, so chat is there's something wrong with the chat. It's okay, some people can't seem to access it. If you want, okay, we can use WhatsApp as our chat, for sending your questions for today. Okay, so let's just do that. Some people might get annoyed, but they should be on the class anyway. Yeah, so just we can do that, inshallah, just to make it easier for everyone. We'll use WhatsApp for chat today, inshallah. Okay, so Yeah, so that's the issue. So if you can send a question, but not everyone will be able to see it. Basically, it will only I'll be able to see it, and I don't know why that's the case. It might be due to some update. So it says فَالرِّضَى بِهِ فَرْضٌ. فَالرِّضَى بِهِ فَرْضٌ. Being pleased with Allah as your Lord is an obligation. That's the way you enter into Islam. If you're not happy with Allah being your Lord, if you're not happy with Islam as your religion, then you're not really a believer. وَالرِّضَى عَنْهُ. And being pleased with Allah decreeing things for you, بما يقضي في كل ما قضى. وإن كان من أجل الأمور وأشرف أنواع العبودية, even though it's from the most honorable affairs and the again the most honorable, ajal and ashraf, very similar in meaning. Even if it's the most honorable of types of servitude, عبودية, فلم يطالب به العموم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فلم يطالب به العموم. Then the umum, meaning the awam, the lay people, are not required to adopt this level of contentment. لعجزهم عنه, because it's due to their inability to reach that level for many of them. For many people, it's too difficult to be content with the things that Allah decrees. ومشقته عليهم, due to the difficulty upon them. وأوجبته طائفة كما أوجب الرضا به. Now, some people, وأوجبته طائفة, so a group of people made it an obligation, just as they made it an obligation to be pleased with Allah as being their Rabb. So they didn't distinguish between الرضا بالله and the رضا عن الله. Okay, but we have distinguished between the two, and we've said that رضا بالله is an obligation and رضا عن الله is it's recommended. And they cited as proof the following: واحتجوا بحجج, and they cited as proofs the following. منها, from those proofs, is that أنه إذا لم يكن راضيا عن ربه فهو ساخط عليه. Okay, that if أنه إذا لم يكن راضيا عن ربه, that if a person is not راضيا عن ربه, if a person is not pleased and content with what Allah has decreed, فهو ساخط عليه, then this means that he has resentment towards Allah for what he decrees. إذ لا واسطة بين الرضا والسخط. Since there is no, essentially there's no third option. ولا واسطة بين الرضا والسخط, meaning there's nothing in between rida and sakhat. So either it's rida or it's sakhat. Either you're pleased or you're not happy with it and you show resentment towards it. وسخط العبد على ربه مناف لرضاه به ربا. And for a servant to show resentment towards his Lord, it opposes munafin, it negates, or it basically opposes taking Allah or being pleased with Allah as your Rabb. It can't coexist. Now this is a type of a logical fallacy. Okay, this is a logical fallacy, right? So this is taking obviously a very binary approach to looking at this question, that it is either this or that. Okay, and that's a logical fallacy. Often people try to pose their arguments by saying, okay, if you don't take this approach, that means you must believe in X, Y, and Z, even though there might be an array of other possibilities. Okay, so and that's quite commonly used by people. This way of arguing, sort of binary approach. So for this reason, this group argued that therefore, if you're not pleased with Allah, that means you must hate and despise or show resentment towards Allah's decree. وقالوا أيضا, and they also cited as proof, فعدم رضاه عنه يستلزم سوء ظنه به ومنازعته في اختياره لعبده. And also they cited as proof that if you're not pleased with what Allah has decreed, this necessitates يستلزم سوء الظن به سوء الظن به سوء ظنه به. Sorry, this necessitates having evil thoughts or negative thoughts about Allah, and it also necessitates munaza'atahu. you're essentially challenging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fi ikhtiyarihi li abdihi, in what he chooses for his servant. You're basically saying, well, I don't really agree with what you've decreed. I don't really agree with it, and you're starting to challenge him. وأن الرب تبارك وتعالى يختار شيئا ويرضاه فلا يختاره لعبده. And this also implies that Allah, he chooses something that he is pleased with, فلا يختاره لعبده, and he's not basically choosing that thing for his servant. Meaning, if he had chosen it for his servant, for the benefit of his servant would have been pleased with it. ولا يرضى به وهذا مناف للعبودية, and his servant won't be pleased with it. So this opposes ubudiyya. Okay, this opposes servitude. This concept of a person, not being pleased with what Allah has decreed, because it leads to all of that. It leads to you having negative thoughts and bad thoughts about Allah. So therefore, it must be an obligation. وقالوا, and they also said, this group, في بعض الآثار الإلهية, in some narrations, and these are probably, as we said, this we've come across this narration before. من لم يرضى بقضائي ولم يصبر على بلائي فليتخذ ربا سوايا. That whoever is not pleased with my decree and he is not patient upon my tribulations, then let him take a Lord other than me. ولا حجة في شيء من ذلك. And then Ibn Qayyim, he says, ولا حجة في شيء من ذلك. And none of these points that he mentions has any real proof in it. He has no leg to stand on with these arguments. And so now what he will do, he will break down these arguments. So he's really mentioned 3 arguments. So again, one of them is that if you're not pleased with Allah, that means you show resentment towards Allah's decree. The second argument was that if you're not pleased with Allah, what Allah decrees, this necessitates that you're having negative thoughts about Allah and that you're challenging Allah's decree, which is obviously opposes ubudiyya. And due to this narration, as we said anyway, it's a narration which is a weak narration. So أما قولهم, as for their saying, إنه لا يتخلص من السخط على ربه إلا بالرضا عنه, that essentially that a person can only إنه لا يتخلص من السخط على ربه إلا بالرضا عنه, that the only way that you can avoid showing resentment towards what Allah decrees for you is by being pleased with what Allah has decreed for you. إذ لا واسطة بين الرضا والسخط, since there is no third option, فكلام مدخول, then this is something which is kalam, then this speech is something which is madkhul. Now, I don't know why in the footnote it says, here in this footnote it says من مخالفات ابن القيم للهروي. This doesn't make sense in my opinion. فكلام madkhul literally means, it's basically it's kalam, it's an opinion which someone has inserted in their line of argument, which basically is baseless. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. And here he puts, this is from the things that Ibn Qayyim differs from Imam al-Harawi, which I suppose that's one of the implications here, but that, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. But anyhow, it's not a major issue. Does Ibn Qayyim typically contradict the author like this? I wouldn't say typically, but there are, I think with every maqam, there are issues that he has with the author. Okay, there are issues that he has. But overall, he generally, falls in, his views fall in line with the view of Imam al-Harawi. And this is because لأن السخط بالمقضي لا يستلزم السخط على ما قضاه. Now Ibn Qayyim, the first line of argument, the first way he sort of differs or responds to, I mean, I would have responded by first saying that this is a logical fallacy. Okay, that just because you don't agree with one thing, it doesn't necessarily necessitate that you have to believe in its opposite. There could be a middle ground. Okay, so it's not so binary and black and white. But Ibn Qayyim says لأن السخط بالمقضي, because showing resentment towards بالمقضي. So remember we differentiate between the qada and the maqdi. Maqdi is the actual thing that has been decreed. So for example, death or the coronavirus. Okay, the fact that people are becoming ill and people are dying, the death itself, dealing with the deaths itself, that's the maqdi. Yeah. So being or showing resentment or not being pleased with the maqdi, the thing that has been decreed, لا يستلزم السخط على من قضاه, does not necessitate, and this is a very subtle point here, does not necessitate showing resentment towards the one who has decreed it. The one who has decreed it. على من قضاه. And who is the one who decreed it? Allah. So Ibn Qayyim is basically saying you can be fine with the fact that Allah has decreed it, but you simply do not have any, you don't have any rida towards the actual thing that has happened. And that's possible. And this answers a question. That's why I was waiting for us to reach this point. A lot of you were asking how to come to terms with having rida with tribulations that can lead to a lot of suffering. Okay, how does a person really, how can they? I mean, at first we said it's number one, it's not an obligation. But even if we said a person, yes, he is pleased, but how can that be if there's a lot of suffering and pain involved? Okay, this is one way of looking at it, is that the fact that Allah has decreed with it, you have no qualms of that. You are fine with Allah decreeing that, because you realize that whatever He decrees is for your best. But dealing with the actual maqdi itself, the thing that has been decreed, for a lot of people, they might not have any rida towards that. And they might hate it, they will despise it, because they can't see the goodness in it, due to their own short-sightedness maybe, or due to them not being able to witness the hikmah of Allah in that action, or in that decree. But towards Allah, they show no resentment. This is a qada of Allah. Okay, so there's that nuance there. كما أن كراهة المقضي وبغضه كما أن كراهة المقضي وبغضه والنفرة عنه لا تستلزم تعلق ذلك بالذي قضاه وقدره. It's the same thing. So, and just as disliking the thing that has been decreed, again, the maqdi, the maqdi, so we need to distinguish between the maqdi and the qada. And likewise, despising it and having a sense of nafra. Nafra is like being aloof to it, or not being aloof to it, but maybe showing an aversion. Showing an aversion to it does not necessitate that that you have that sakhat and that karaha towards the one who has decreed it. فالمقضي قد يسخطه العبد, and so the maqdi, a person could show resentment towards it and not like it. وهو راض عمن قدره وقضاه, but he is pleased, he is fine with the one who has decreed it, أي Allah. بل يجتمع تسخطه والرضا بنفس القضاء. And that's a summary. That's a really, perhaps this can summarize this particular point here, that يجتمع تسخطه, that his tasakhut, his resentment and displeasure, as well as being pleased with Allah, can be combined together for the same thing, for the same decree. بنفس القضاء. So if Allah decreed death, that someone in your family passed away, you can't deal with that. You with the death itself, the fact that that person has died, you are extremely upset and you're not pleased with that. You're not happy with it. But the fact that Allah has decreed it, you have no qualms of that. You realize that that's something that Allah has decreed for a wisdom that maybe you have not perceived. What is meant by qada of Allah? The decree of Allah. Now, in this footnote here, this is where it gets somewhat contentious. So for those who read Arabic, مسألة الرضا بالقضاء دون المقضي فصل الكلام فيها شيخ الإسلام في معرض الحديث عن الرسالة القشيرية وشرح لبعض ما ورد عن أعلام الطرق ممن زل في هذا الباب على النقيض من المعتزلة. So here there are some theological issues. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote about this, and how some of the author of Risala al-Qushayri or Imam al-Qushayri. So anyway, for those who want to look into it further detailed, it's there. There are references there. But this footnote takes a very one-sided view to this topic. I'm not going to really entertain that discussion here. Kama sayati, as will come. So he will speak about this division of maqdi and qada in a bit more detail later, inshallah. Aqdar, the plural of qadar is aqdar. Did anyone realistically live according to the high ideals of the author? Well, I mean, we have awliya, lives of, and we have obviously saints and pious worshippers and elite worshippers from the past, which I'm sure that they definitely would have lived according to many of these values. One would imagine if the decreed thing is wrong by Sharia, for example, oppression, then to dislike it would be morally right thing, though you realize the redemptive opportunity as a form of contentment in God. Yes, this is an important point, and he will speak about this. Okay, he's going to distinguish between basically Allah's will, al-irada al-kawniyya and shari'iyya. Okay, so things like dhulm, it's very different to say Allah decreeing that people worship him, or Allah decreeing that a person worships Allah and that he does Hajj. They're two different things. So we will speak about that, inshallah. He will speak about that, but that's important. It's an important question. Does the qada being spoken of here also encompass qadr shar'i? As this has interesting. So this will all come. He's going to explain this, and this is going to be quite an intense lesson, by the way. From now onwards, so pay attention. But these issues that you are raising will be discussed. From the long hadith in Bukhari, I do not hesitate about it. Okay. He hates death and I hate her. No, I think that's different. When you say he hates death, meaning not when we say a person hates death, it's not the fact that Allah decrees death for us. It's the experience of death that we dislike. So it's not really relating to the qada itself. Okay, and so hence the hadith mentions hating death generally. No one really likes the idea of going through sakarat al-maut and these things. So that's not to do with Allah decreeing it, but that's just a reality that people don't like. So it's not really connected. Okay, so moving on. وأما قولكم إنه يستلزم سوء الظن العبد بربه ومنازعته له في اختياره. As for the saying, and here he's quoting those who believe that essentially it's wajib to have rida, that if you don't have it, if you don't have rida with what Allah decrees, then this implies su'a dhann, implies of having negative thoughts of yourself, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and challenging him in his choices for what he decrees for you. فَلَيْسَ كَذَلِكَ. He said this is not the case. بَلْ هُوَ حُسْنُ الظَّنِّ بِرَبِّهِ فِي الْحَالَتَيْنِ. In fact, it's the opposite. Dare I say, Ibn Qayyim is falling into the same mistake as his opponent here, in the sense of seeing it as. Anyway, you'll see what I mean. بل هو حسن الظن بربه في الحالتين. In fact, it's حسن الظن بربه. In fact, it's having good thoughts about Allah in both cases. فإنه إنما يسخط المقدور وينازعه بمقدور آخر. Because فإنه يسخط المقدور, because he might dislike al-maqdur. Notice how he differentiates between qadar and maqdur. So here we have two terms. Now, if you in the last lesson, because as you know, just to be clear with these terms, so we have the concept of qada and qadar. Loosely translated, both of these things refer to fate and predestination. Now, sometimes we refer to these terms independently, qadar, and just mean fate by it. Now, but is there a difference between the two? Qada and qadar. Is there a difference between the two? Now here there is difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Some say qada refers to al-jumla, meaning it refers to the general decrees, or the general decreeing that Allah does, meaning nothing happens in life except by the qada of Allah. Okay, meaning everything happens by the will of Allah, by His decree. Qadar refers to the tafasil, it refers to the details, the detailed things that, okay, so yes, Allah decrees everything, but He also decrees that this person will die at this moment. He also decrees that this person will have this amount of children and this amount of rizq. That's the qadar. Okay, and some even went the other way around. They said it's the opposite. It's not a major issue in terms of which way around it is. So that refers to the process, okay? That refers to the process, the action of Allah decreeing these things. Now, when Allah decrees something, that action itself becomes, or that thing that He decrees, whether it's birth, death, illness, loss of property, loss of life, being oppressed, being wronged, that particular thing, we call it's not the qada, because the qada is the process, this is the action of Allah decreeing. It becomes the maqdi. And the qadar itself becomes the maqdur. So the maqdur and the maqdi, they are the individual things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually decreed. And the qada and the qadar refers to the process. So that's why we say ar-rida anillah wa rida bi qada'illah. Okay, what they mean by bi qada'illah is the actual maqdi itself. Yeah, please, if you have questions, because I can't look at both chat boxes at the same time. Put all your questions on WhatsApp, because yeah. Okay. Right. So yes, so going back to Ibn Qayyim, so he says, فإنه يسخط المقدور. So when a person essentially shows resentment to an individual thing that Allah has decreed, a maqdur, وينازعه بمقدور آخر, then he will essentially challenge that with, or show resistance to it with another maqdur, with another thing that Allah has decreed. كما ينازع القدر الذي يكرهه ربه بالقدر الذي يحبه ويرضاه. Just as كما ينازع القدر الذي يكرهه ربه, just as his Lord essentially will decree something that he dislikes, but that will be challenged with something that he likes. Okay, now pay attention. فينازع قدر الله بقدر الله بالله ولله كما يستعيذ برضاه من سخطه وبمعافاته عن عقوبته ويستعيذ به منه. Okay, so essentially what he's saying here is that when a person finds it an issue, or finds it difficult to deal with an individual thing that Allah has decreed, it could be due to the fact that there is something else that is challenging him for that. So for example, he gives example, for example, when we seek refuge in Allah from Allah, we seek refuge in Allah from Allah. وَنَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْكَ, as the Prophet used to say in his dua. We seek refuge in you, from you. So just as we are afraid of you, we also seek refuge in you. So just as you might dislike or find it difficult to deal with a qadr of Allah, with something that Allah has decreed, a maqdur, but from a different perspective, it's maybe due to another reality that you another reality, for example, that which is recognized by Allah as a virtuous quality, why you have an issue with it. So for example, if your parent dies or if your child dies, if your parent dies, then naturally you won't be happy with that. But there are so many things lost, good things that the Sharia recognizing, birrul walidain, that is lost by losing this decree, by this death. So when someone dies, you've lost birrul walidain, being in most cases. Obviously there are certain things you can still do, like dua for them, sadaqah, etc. But otherwise, generally, birrul walidain will disappear. Being good to your parents, the very notion of that will disappear after they pass away. So you're disliking it from one angle, but you are pleased from it from another perspective. Just like someone who said that the masajid are closed due to COVID, but yeah, I mean, look, with what happened with COVID and everything, what's happening with COVID, so many people, I've heard so many people feel as though this Ramadan was one of the best Ramadans that they've had. So, okay. So, وَأَمَّا كَوْنُهُ يَخْتَارُ لِنَفْسِهِ مَا يَخْتَارُهُ الرَّبُّ. As for يَخْتَارُ لِنَفْسِهِ مَا يَخْتَارُهُ الرَّبُّ, that فهذا موضع التفصيل لا يسحب عليه ذيل النفي والإثبات فاختيار الرب لعبده نوعان. So as for choosing for himself what Allah chooses for him, okay, now you choose for yourself, or you prefer for yourself what Allah prefers for you, or what Allah chooses for you. This requires some detail, as he mentions. هذا موضع التفصيل لا يسحب عليه ذيل النفي والإثبات. It's not something that you can sort of negate and affirm very easily. It requires some detail. فاختيار الرب لعبده نوعان. So the things that Allah chooses for his servant are of two types. The things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses for his servant are of two types, or two categories. نوعان. أحدهما, the first, اختيار ديني شرعي. And this goes back to the question Sa'id raised. اختيار ديني شرعي. Something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses for you to do, and that relates to your religion, and something that Allah legislates for you. So these things, like Allah wants you to pray 5 times a day, Allah wants you to pay zakat. فالواجب على العبد ألا يختار في هذا النوع غير ما اختاره له سيده. So the obligation for the servant in this situation, that he shouldn't choose anything other than what his master has chosen for him. So for example, Allah decrees that you pray 5 times a day. Well, you don't turn around and say, well, I'm not really pleased with that, and I think, we should pray 2 times a day or 1 time a day. So opposing that's contradictory to the essence of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قال الله تعالى, Allah says, وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. That it is not befitting for a believer, whether male or female believer, if Allah and His Messenger decree a matter, that they have a choice in that matter. أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. Now, قضى, إذا قضى الله ورسوله, if Allah and the Messenger decree something. Now, Allah is not talking about decrees pertaining to incidents, things that occur in life, the universal decrees, they're often referred to as universal decrees, not shari'i decrees, but universal decrees. Like death, like change of weather, illness, sickness, poverty, richness, etc. He's not talking about this. Here he's talking about a religious decree. So if Allah and His messenger, because obviously the messenger clearly cannot decree whether a person dies or not, whether it rains or not. So this is relating to religious decrees. فاختيار العبد خلاف ذلك مناف لإيمانه وتسليمه. So for a servant to choose and to prefer other than that, it goes against his iman and his submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَرِضَاهُ بِاللَّهِ رَبًّا وَبِإِسْلَامِ دِينًا وَبِمُحَمَّدٍ رَسُولًا. And it goes against his very notion of being pleased with Allah as your Lord, with Islam as your religion, and Muhammad as your messenger. So that's the first type of decree, or the first type of choice that Allah, the choices that Allah makes. One is relating to religion. النوع الثاني, the second type, اختيار كوني قدري. اختيار كوني قدري. So this is the universal choices that Allah makes. قدري. لا يسخطه الرب. And these are not despised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كالمصائب التي يبتلي الله بها عبده. Like tribulations that Allah tests His servants with. فهذا لا يضره فراره منها إلى القدر الذي يرفعها عنه. So here, fleeing from this decree, trying to flee from it, doesn't harm him, because you're fleeing from his decree to another one of his decrees. So if Allah decrees that you are afflicted with poverty, does that mean that you just accept it and say, this is the qadr of Allah, this is the qada of Allah, let me accept it and be content with it? No, there's no harm in you fleeing from that decree to going to another decree of Allah. Like with the case of the famous saying of Umar ibn Khattab, نَفِرُّ مِنْ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ إِلَى قَدَرِ اللَّهِ. That when it came to the plague, people, someone said to him, أَفِرَارًا مِنَ الْمَوْتِ يَا ibn Khattab, يا أمير المؤمنين, are you fleeing from death? And he said, no, نَفِرُّ مِنْ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ إِلَى قَدَرِ اللَّهِ. We're fleeing from death, from a decree of Allah to another decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَدْفَعُهَا وَيَكْشِفُهَا. So he's trying to repel that. وَلَيْسَ فِي ذَلِكَ مُنَازَعَ لِلرُّبُوبِيَّةِ. And that, you're not challenging Allah's lordship when you show resistance to these decrees. Meaning, for example, as is the case with dhulm. Okay? Actually, wait, the dhulm one will come a bit later, because here he's talking about things that Allah does not despise. Like masa'ib. Okay, Allah testing people through trials and tribulations. Allah doesn't despise that. I mean, He does that for a reason. Okay, but we will find it difficult to deal with. So there's no harm in you not being content with that, because then your idea is to flee from it, to take yourself out of that state to another decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you're being wrong, you don't say, well, this is dhulm, Allah has decreed it, let me just be content with it and let it happen. No, try to, especially if someone else is doing some wrongdoing, you don't want your position on this to allow people, to give people the green light to commit dhulm as well. So وَلَيْسَ فِي ذَلِكَ مُنَازَعَ لِلرُّبُوبِيَّةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ فِيهِ مُنَازَعَ لِلْقَدَرِ بِالْقَدَرِ. So you're not challenging Allah's decision, even though there is a type of munaza'a, challenging with one qadar with another qadar. So when we try to flee from death due to the plague, as Umar ibn Khattab did, but he's trying to flee to another qadar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the dislike of a decreed matter to not be blameworthy has to be for a praiseworthy reason. As you said, the dislike of death of parents is an absence to show bir, rather than the more obvious sense of missing an all, say, for example. Yeah, okay, that's fine. What do we mean by opposing in the first situation? What if someone's internal state finds it difficult to be pleased with the choice but knows it's from Allah? Now that's different. Yeah, now that's different, because this may be due to shahwa, for example, wearing hijab. Yeah, so this is different. Here he's talking. We're talking about when there's a sort of that challenge of aqdar. Okay, here we're not talking about It will come. It will come. It will all fall into place, inshallah. You will see, inshallah. If it doesn't, then we will go back to it, inshallah. So he says, فَهَذَا. So this, dealing with this second type of choices, the choices of Allah, and trying to flee from it, or trying, or not being essentially content with it. فهذا يكون تارة واجبا. So sometimes it's واجب, وتارة يكون مستحبا, وتارة يكون مباحا, مستوي الطرفين, وتارة يكون حراما, وتارة يكون مكروها. So resisting, being pleased, here he's talking about هذا, and he's talking about the ikhtiyar, okay, meaning the being content with these choices of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes it could be wajib, sometimes it could be recommended, sometimes it could be permissible, sometimes it can be haram, وَتَارَةً يَكُونُ مَكْرُوهًا, okay, and sometimes it can even be disliked, okay. So when can it be haram, do you think? وَتَارَةً يَكُونُ حَرَامًا. This is in reference to the ikhtiyar kawni qadari. Showing resistance to the decree, isn't this the use of our free will? If a preventable calamity is apparent and you choose inaction, that's haram. I mean, that's true, although I don't think that's yeah, I mean, so by going to a place of plague, knowingly, and then saying, if it is written for us to die, then so be it. Yeah, that's a good example. Okay, putting yourself in harm's way. Okay, using qadar as an example. Okay, putting qadar as an example. That's very good. And likewise the mushrikeen would often, this was their argument. Okay, like if Allah had willed, we would not have committed shirk. So, let us be content with what Allah has decreed for us. We decide, if we decide to commit shirk. Okay, and by the way, I mean, there are many people who have taken that approach with regards to COVID-19. They're like, no, tawakkul ala Allah. Let's just have tawakkul, put themselves in harm's way, and say, if it happens, it's the qadr of Allah. Everything happens by the qadr of Allah. Okay, so they think that they exhibit more taqwa, and they're stronger believers by taking that approach. Okay, that haphazard approach and that reckless approach. Okay, reckless approach by saying, let's just no, keep the masajid all open. This is tawakkul. I have tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. This is reckless behavior. And it's not from tawakkul, and in a way, I hope this isn't the case. But I hope this isn't the case for people that took that approach. That it was a way of trying to show a false sense of taqwa. Okay, and that they're better than others. I hope that wasn't the case. But did the Sahaba not make dua to die of the plague? No, there's a difference between a person being in a situation where they are surrounded by the plague. When you're in that situation, but don't put yourself in that position. They're two different things. So that's why the scholars, the Hanabila were of the view, for example, that you don't do dua for Allah to remove a plague. You don't do qunut nazila. That was a view of the Hanabila. The other scholars didn't agree on this. But the Hanabila said don't do dua of qunut to remove the waba, to remove the plague, the ta'un, because this death is good for the believers. It's khair, it's shahada for the believers. And that's definitely questionable. Okay, as I mean, again, it's a matter of khilaf, but the Hanabila, that was a view of the but that's about people who are already in that position. Okay, we're not saying, put yourself in that position, okay, and use qadr of Allah as an excuse. No, if you're in that position, then that's it. Nothing else you can do about it. You can't flee. Okay, so what do you do? And would someone, like when someone prays for me because Allah did not decree for me to be of those who pray? Exactly. That's the wrong approach to take, and that's something which is very common as well. I've met many people like that. Okay, right. We'll take a break, inshallah. Let's take a break. We've gone on for over an hour now. If we resume at 7 past, inshallah, so 8:07, we will resume, inshallah. Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. For those who've joined us a bit late, if you have any questions, just send it through to the via WhatsApp, because we have some issues with the chat feature on Zoom. Okay. So we've spoken about now the things that Allah chooses and decrees. We've said there's of two types: those which are essentially related to the religion itself, and then you have and that's something that you must essentially be content with and be pleased with. And then you have other things which are related to what we call universal decrees, as I said, with a life, death, poverty, oppression, etc. But the first, he spoke about those things that Allah la yaskhutuhu, those things that Allah doesn't dislike, such as tribulations by which He tests believers. That's something that He doesn't. That's not something that He dislikes. But then He says, "Amma al-qadr alladhi la yuhibbuhu wa la yardahu." Now this is the interesting one, and there are a lot of philosophical questions that people raise today, such as the problem of evil. Okay, why does evil occur? If there is a God, why does evil occur? So that's related to this point here. And by the way, for those who are interested in this mas'ala, there is the Islamic Text Society translated a part of Ibn Qayyim's book Madārij al Sālikīn. Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada, which is another book of Ibn Qayyim's, where he deals with this issue of the problem of evil. So they've translated that. So I think it's just called The Problem of Evil by Ibn Qayyim. It's published by Islamic Text Society. It's a red book. And so it was taken from Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada. I think it was taken from Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada. If it's not from there, from Shifa'ul Alil, which is another book that Ibn Qayyim wrote just on the topic of Qadr. It's one of the most detailed books on the topic of Qadr, called Shifa'ul Alil. And that is not translated into English. So, وَأَمَّا الْقَدْرَ الَّذِي لَا يُحِبُّهُ وَلَا يَرْضَى. As for the qadr which Allah does not like, nor is He pleased with, مثل قدر المعائب والذنوب, such as decreeing people to have faults and blemishes and sins. When I say blemishes, I mean in terms of character. And sins, people committing sins, because obviously people commit sins through the qadr of Allah. Allah allows it to happen. فَالْعَبْدُ مَأْمُورٌ بِسَخَطِهَا. So this type of this type of decree we are ordered to despise and to have resentment towards. So we are ordered. We don't say someone commits a sin and says, "MashaAllah, qadr of Allah." Yeah. No, we're ordered to despise it, even though it was decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in fact, we are manhiyun anir rida biha. And that we're not just commanded to despise it, but we are actually prohibited to be content with it. So that's a type of rida that is prohibited, to be content with sin, transgression. وهذا هو التفصيل الواجب في الرضا بالقضاء. And so she said this type of nuance in detail, it's required when it comes to rida with the decree of Allah. We can't just say, well, decree of, lump all of rida into one place and say, well, rida is wajib, or it's all recommended. No, it depends. There needs to be more nuancy. Otherwise, a lot of people can end up having misconceptions about many things, in particular in relation to qada and qadar, and the issue of evil. People think, why does Allah allow evil to occur? وقد اضطرب الناس في ذلك اضطرابا عظيما. And he said people have really become confused about this greatly. اضطرابا عظيما. اضطراب literally means to shake. I mean, they're confused. A lot of people are confused about this. ونجا منها أصحاب الفرق والتفصيل. And the various different groups have saved themselves from this predicament. The various different sects and groups and those who went into further detail. فإن اللفظ الرضا بالقضاء, because this phrase الرضا بالقضاء لفظ محمود مأمور به, it's a phrase which is praiseworthy, to be pleased with what Allah has decreed. It's something which is ordered in our Sharia. وهو من مقامات الصديقين, and it's from the stations of the truthful. فصار له حرمة. And so therefore, because it's a phrase, and this is really important, because you can learn a lot from this, because there's so much we can relate to this. This phrase, الرضا بالقضاء, being pleased with what Allah has decreed, that's a phrase. It's almost a slogan, you can say. Dare I say it, it's like a slogan which is praiseworthy in essence. مأمور به وهو, and it's from the مقامات of the صديقين. فصار له حرمة أوجبت لطائفة قبولها من غير تفصيل. And so as a result, because it's become like a slogan, it's developed a hurma, a sanctity. It's developed a sanctity that has, therefore it's become, for a certain group of people, you accept it without any detail, without any tafsil, without any detail whatsoever. You just accept it. And as a result, it can lead to misconceptions. It can lead to, in many cases, deviancy as well. And we can relate to that today because, there are many things that people throw around today, in our own discourses and our own discussions. Almost we can say sloganeering. And because the phrases are very sacred phrases, I mean, take for example, and I hate to always mention this and bring it up all the time, but in al hukmu illa lillah, in al hukmu illa lillah, and that's a phrase. In fact, it's a phrase which it is an ayah of the Quran, right? And so, because it's such a praiseworthy phrase, it's a true saying. It's a true saying. It's a kalimatu haqq. It's a true saying, but it's developed a hurma, a level of sanctity and sacredness. And so, because it's so sacred, you can't go anywhere near it. It's so sacred, you can't go anywhere near it. And so people have to accept it wholeheartedly without any detail. So anything that comes close to opposing in al-hukmu illallah, you have to deny it and reject it straight away, which is what the Khawarij did. Because the Khawarij, they took that ayah in al-hukmu illa lillah, they understood it in an unrestricted way, without any tafsil, without any tafsil, and as a result, they ended up being who they became, Khawarij. So, and that's why there needs to be nuancy, there needs to be tafsil, and that's why we have this problem with many groups. They fail to understand, the concept of tahakum and al-hukum bi-ghayri ma anzal Allah, and man-made laws, and ruling by other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed. They're guilty of this in many ways. So they said وظنوا أن كل ما كان مقضيا للرب تعالى مخلوقا ينبغي الرضا به. So this group, for example, they thought that everything that Allah decrees, it's something which is created, ينبغي, you must be pleased with it. You must be pleased with it. ثم انقسموا فرقتين. And then this group, basically, who took a very simplistic view, very, very simplistic view to it, without looking at the nuances, they subdivided into two further groups. قالت فرقة, one group, they said, إذا كان القضاء والرضا متلازمين فمعلوم أننا مأمورون ببغض المعاصي والكفر والظلم فلا تكون مقضية مقدرة. Okay, another logical fallacy. So one group, they said, if qada and rida, if Allah's decree and contentment and being pleased with what He has decreed are mutalazimain, meaning they mutually necessitate one another, meaning if there's something that Allah has decreed, then you must have rida for it. If that is the case, فَمَعْلُومٌ, then if that is the case, then it is known that we are required to despise sins. That's a given. We are required to despise sins. Kufr and dhulm, disbelief and oppression and wrongdoing. Therefore, فَلَا تَكُونُ مَقْضِيَةً مُقَدَّرًا. Therefore, these things, sins, kufr, dhulm, they are not being decreed by Allah. They have not been decreed by Allah. They are not maqdiya muqaddara. They haven't been decreed by Allah. Because had they been decreed by Allah, it would have been wajib for us to be pleased with them. Because whatever Allah decrees, you're meant to have rida of it. Okay? And we are not meant to have rida of sin. So that must mean that sins and disbelief haven't been decreed by Allah. Okay, so this is the argument of the Mu'tazilites. Okay, the Mu'tazilites, they were of this view, the rationalist school of thought. Okay, and to be honest, it's a logical fallacy. I mean, there's more detail to this argument, by the way. Okay, there's more. The Mu'tazilites have a more of a detailed explanation to this. This is a very basic presentation of their argument. Okay, and that's the case if you were to actually, because most people don't read the works of the Mu'tazilites, okay, because they're told not to, right? So they only understand, or they only get shown what the Mu'tazilites believe by the works of those who are refuting them. And often you find the people that refute the works of the Mu'tazilites or the opinions of the Mu'tazilites, they present the views of the Mu'tazilites in a very simplistic way. I'm not doing this in order to defend the Mu'tazilites. Don't worry, I'm not a Mu'tazilite. But fairness has to be given. People have to be just in the way they present other people's views. And this happens a lot. It happens everywhere. Okay? Salafis do it with Ash'aris. Ash'aris do it with Salafis. Deobandis do it with Brehlevis. Brehlevis do it with Deobandis. It happens everywhere. Okay? So, but anyhow, that's the... that's a side point. So, is this point clear though? Okay, so this is another logical fallacy where if it's it's either A or B. I mean, there's no third equation. There's no third possibility. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So again, their line of argument is that if we're meant to be pleased with what Allah has decreed, then sins and kufr can't be decreed by Allah, because we're meant to despise sins and kufr and disbelief. وفرقة قالت, okay, and another sect, they said, قد دل العقل والشرع على أنها واقعة بقضاء الله وقدره فنحن نرضى بها. This is the other side of the spectrum. They're going to the other extreme. So they said, قد دل العقل, our intellects and Sharia has shown us that these things happen by the qada of Allah and His decree and His destiny, meaning sins and kufr and dhulm. These things happen by the qada of Allah. So you can't reject that. So the Mu'tazilites rejected it from sin. They said, no, Allah doesn't create, He doesn't decree sin. That's our choice, completely our choice. Allah can't stop you from committing sin. This was the view of the Mu'tazilites. So therefore, but the other view went to the other extreme. They said, no, all of these things, whether it's obedience or disobedience, is decreed by Allah. Therefore, فَنَحْنُ نَرْضَى بِهَا. Therefore, فَنَحْنُ نَرْضَى بِهَا. Therefore, we are pleased with that. Therefore, meaning we're meant to be pleased and content with kufr and disbelief, which is obviously an astray opinion. Just look at the footnote here, 9, al-Jabariyya wa Sufiyya. Jabariyya I can understand, but to attribute this view just to the Sufiyya, subhanallah. I mean, that's injustice, in my opinion. And it's a view of maybe some of the Sufiyya, but to label it, because the Sufiyya of a very vast spectrum, okay? So to attribute that to the Sufiyya, I think is injustice. But that was done in the footnote. That's not what Ibn Qayyim said. وَالطَّائِفَتَانِ مُنْحَرِفَتَانِ جَائِرَتَانِ. So both groups are munharifatan. They've deviated, okay? They've gone off the mark. And qasd as-sabil, they're away from the middle path. فَأُولَٰئِكَ أَخْرَجُوهَا عَنْ قَضَاءِ الرَّبِّ وَقَدَرِهِ. So فَأُولَٰئِك, meaning the Mu'tazilites, they basically removed sins and disbelief and dhulm from Allah's decree. وَهَؤُلَاء, and the second group, رَضُوا بِهَا وَلَمْ يَسْخَطُوهَا. And the other group, they basically were pleased with sin and transgression, and they didn't dislike it, and they didn't despise it. هؤلاء خالفوا الرب تعالى في رضاه وسخطه وخرجوا عن شرعه ودينه. And this people, they've opposed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in what pleases Him and what displeases Him. وخرجوا عن شرعه ودينه, and they have departed from His sharia and His deen. وأولئك أنكروا تعلق القضائه وقدره بها. And the others basically denied Allah decrees those things. So that's a bit of a repetition there. Then he says, واختلفت طرق أهل الإثبات للقدر والشرع في جواب الطائفتين. So he said the أهل الإثبات. Okay, so this is a phrase, أهل الإثبات. Okay, this is a phrase which is usually used to refer to the people who would affirm. They affirm what Allah affirms for Himself. So a lot of the deviant sects were known for negating things. So the Mu'tazilites would negate qada and qadar, and as we said, some would negate attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. So Ahlul Ithbat, they were known for being people who would affirm whatever Allah affirms for Himself. So the way that Ahlul Ithbat, the way that basically the people of Ithbat, those who do not reject tenets in creed, the way that they essentially dealt with this issue, they dealt with it differently. اختلفت طرق أهل الإثبات للقدر والشرع في جواب الطائف, in the way that they would respond to these two deviant groups. Yeah, when they say خرج عن شرعه ودينه, I assume he is not implying they are مخرج من الملة, that they have been taken out of the fold of Islam. I mean, that phrase, you could potentially argue that. Whether he intends that or not, Allah knows best. Okay. فقال الطائفة, so one group of people, in the way that they would respond to these two groups, they said لم يقم دليل من الكتاب والسنة ولا الإجماع على جواز الرضا بكل قضاء فضلا عن وجوبه واستحبابه. They said that there is not a single evidence from the Quran and Sunnah or Ijma' that points to the permissibility of being pleased with everything that Allah has decreed. There's no evidence for that. There's no evidence in the Quran and Sunnah to say that we should be pleased with everything that Allah has decreed. فضلا عن وجوب واستحباب, let alone it being an obligation or it being recommended. Okay, so there's nothing that says it's even permissible to be pleased with everything that Allah has decreed with, let alone there being any text to indicate it's wajib or recommended, everything. فأين أمر الله عباده فأين أمر الله عباده ورسوله أن يرضوا بكل ما قضاه الله وقدره. So where is that decree? Where is it that Allah has commanded His servants and His messengers to be pleased with everything that Allah has decreed? There's no indication of that. وهذه طريقة كثير من أصحابنا وغيرهم. So he said this particular way of dealing with this predicament has been adopted by many of our companions. كثير من أصحابنا. Ashab here he refers to the Hanabila. Okay, كثير من أصحابنا. So the phrase ashab, whenever used by Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah, then they usually mean by that the Hanabila. وبه أجاب القاضي أبو يعلى وابن الباقلاني. And this was the answer of Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, but also interestingly Ibn al-Baqillani, who was not actually Athari or Hanbali in creed. So that's one way of dealing with it. Basically, it's quite a fairly simple answer. Look, there's nowhere in the Sharia, or there's nowhere in the Quran or Sunnah that says that you must be pleased with everything that Allah has decreed. There are generic verses and hadith that tell you to be pleased with what Allah has decreed, but they're generic. That doesn't mean absolutely everything. So that's one. قال فإن قيل, but then if it's said, أفترضون بقضاء الله وقدره, are you pleased with Allah's decrees? Okay, are you meant to be pleased with Allah's decrees? قيل له, it said to him, it will say to him, نرضى بقضاء الله الذي هو خلقه or الذي هو خلقه. We are pleased with what Allah has decreed, i.e. that thing that Allah has created. الذي أمرنا أن نرضى به, those things that we are commanded to be pleased with. ولا نرضى من ذلك ما نهانا عنه أن نرضى به, and we are not pleased we're not pleased with those things that Allah has prohibited us to be pleased with, i.e. sin and transgression. ولا نتقدم بين يدي الله تعالى ولا نعترض على حكمه, and so we don't basically نتقدم بين يدي الله, that we don't come in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or basically oppose any of His decrees. So there are things that He has decreed and He has asked us to be pleased with, like His deen and His sharia. There are things we are recommended to be pleased with, like His qadar, universal decrees. But then there are things which He has decreed which we're not meant to, which we are prohibited to be pleased with, sin and transgression. And we shouldn't oppose those things that He has decreed. وقالت طائفة أخرى, and another group, they said, يطلق الرضا بالقضاء في الجملة دون التفاصيل المقضي بالمقدر. So another group, they said, then this is a slightly more nuanced and more detailed approach, that يطلق الرضا بالقضاء في الجملة, and that's something we spoke about before, that the term رضا, being pleased with what Allah has decreed, then we say yes, you're meant to be pleased with what Allah has decreed, generally speaking, في الجملة, generally speaking. دون تفاصيل المقضي المقدر, but this might not necessarily apply in the detailed things that Allah has decreed. Al-Maqdi al-Muqaddar. Al-Muqaddar here means Maqdur. Same thing. So generally speaking, we are pleased with what Allah has decreed. Whatever Allah decrees, we're meant to be pleased with it. But then there are individual things that we might not apply that to, like cases of sin and transgression. فنقول, so we say therefore, نرضى بقضاء الله جملة ولا نسخطه, that we are pleased with what Allah has decreed in general terms, and we do not show any resentment towards it. وَلَا نُطْلِقُ الرِّضَى عَلَى كُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّن تَفَاصِيلِ الْمَقْضِي. But we do not attribute contentment to every single individual thing that He has decreed. فكما يقول المسلمون, just as the Muslims they say, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ يَبِيدُ وَيَهْلَكُ. Just as we say, Muslims will say, everything يَبِيدُ وَيَهْلَكُ, everything will eventually perish and be destroyed. وَلَا يَقُولُونَ حُجَجَ اللَّهِ تَبِيدُ وَتَهْلَكُ. But we do not say the proofs of Allah will come to an end and will be destroyed. Allah's signs will always be there in that sense. So meaning, we say generic statements, like we say, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ, everything will be destroyed. Now, obviously we don't apply that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. وَيَقُولُونَ, and they say, رَبُّ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَلَا يُضِيفُونَ رُبُوبِيَّتَهُ إِلَى الْأَعْيَانِ الْمُسْتَخْبَثَةِ الْمُسْتَقْذَرَةِ بِخُصُوصِهَا. Like we say, Allah is رَبُّ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. Allah is the Lord of everything. Allah is the Lord of everything. Now, do we attribute His rububiyyah to specific things which are mustakhbatha and mustaqdhara, which things which are filthy and dirty? You know, do we say Allah is the, astaghfirullah, I don't even want to say it, but Allah is the Lord of X, Y, and Z, and the X, Y, and Z are filthy and dirty and horrid things? We don't say that. We don't say that. That's not appropriate to say. Okay. So therefore, in our religion, we have statements which are very generic, but will have exceptions. That's the point here. But we shouldn't fall into that thing, that very important thing that Ibn Qayyim mentions, where he says here, where when a statement becomes so lofty and sacred that we implement it unrestrictedly. فصار له حرمة أوجبت لطائفة قبوله من غير تفصيل. Okay, this is a very important point, that point that he mentioned there. Okay. وقالت طائفة أخرى, another group, they said, نرضى بها من جهة إضافتها إلى الرب خلقا ومشيئة. That another group, they said that we are pleased with whatever Allah decrees from the perspective من جهة إضافتها إلى الرب خلقا ومشيئة, from the perspective that we of attributing this to Allah in terms of creation and will. Meaning, we are pleased at the fact that Allah has decreed this. Meaning He's allowed it to happen. Mashi'a, He's willed it to happen. ونسخطها من جهة إضافتها إلى العبد كسبا وقياما به. But we despise it from the perspective of this action being attributed to the servant, because this is something that he has kasban, has something that he has earned for himself, and something that he's done himself. So when someone commits sin, when someone has committed kufr, this has happened by the qadr of Allah. That aspect we are content with, meaning, look, if this is something that Allah has decreed and allowed to happen, we are content with that. But as for the servant, as for the person committing that sin or that act of kufr, we despise that because he has earned it for himself, but Allah has willed it to happen. And hence we make that distinction between the qada and the maqdi, between the qadar and the maqdur, as we spoke about before. Without that distinction, it will, be, without that distinction, it will be problematic. That's where the problems arise. وقال طائفة أخرى, and another group, they said, بل نرضى بالقضاء ونسخط المقضي. Okay, which is basically, that's what we've been saying. So there is a slight difference between the two. We'll make that clear. So another group, they said, we are pleased with the qada, but we dislike the maqdi, i.e. the actual thing that has been decreed. In this case, it's like sin and transgression. فالرضا والسخط لم يتعلقا بشيء واحد. So both attributes of rida and sakhat, being pleased and showing resentment, they are not connected to one thing, because there are two things. Remember, there's the process of decreeing something, and then there's the actual thing that has been decreed. They're two different things. That's what we were speaking about before. The last point actually is slightly, it's a variation of that. But yeah, so the point before is basically saying we are pleased with the fact that Allah has decreed it, but we dislike it from the fact that the servant has earned it for himself. I mean, he has earned that sin. He has developed, or not developed, kasban, he has earned it, meaning he has done it himself. وهذه الأجوبة لا يتمشى شيء منها على أصول من يجعل محبة الرب تعالى ورضاه ومشيئته واحدة كما هو أحد قولي الأشعرية وأكثر أتباعه. So he says these answers, the last few answers that we've mentioned, لا يتمشى شيء منها, meaning they are not applicable, and they cannot come into being if we were to say that the loving Allah, being pleased with him, his will, all those things are one thing, if it's one entity. So meaning if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that must mean you are pleased with everything that he decrees. And okay, so it just is like one entity. We don't distinguish between al-qada and al-maqdi. If we don't make that distinction, then the previous answers won't make any sense. كما هو أحد قولي الأشعرية وأكثر أتباعي, as seems to be the case, that this is one of the two opinions of the Ash'aris, and this is the case for most of his followers, which definitely is very contentious. I don't believe that's an accurate portrayal of how the Ash'aris believe this. Okay, so the Ash'aris won't they most of them won't say that. Okay, and this is very common, by the way. Like you find, especially in matters of Aqidah and Usul, people say this is the view of the Ash'aris, but in reality that's not the view of the Ash'aris. Like when they say, for example, you can't do ta'leel to Allah's actions. Okay, those who study a bit of Usul al-Fiqh, they say this is the position of the Ash'ari. The position of the Ash'ari is that there's no ta'leel to af'alullah. The actions of Allah are not mu'allala. Which in practice, none of the Ash'aris really believe that in practice. Anyhow, don't worry about that point too much. فَإِنَّ هَؤُلَاءِ يَقُولُونَ, for these people they say, إِنَّ كُلَّ مَا شَاءَهُ وَقَضَاهُ, because everything that Allah has willed and decreed, فَقَدْ أَحَبَّهُ وَرَضِيَهُ, everything that Allah has willed and decreed, then that means Allah likes it and is pleased with it. But they don't all say that. Okay, that's we said that. وَإِذَا كَانَ الْكَوْنُ مَحْبُوبًا لَهُ مَرْضِيًّا فَنَحْنُ نُحِبُّ مَا أَحَبَّهُ وَنَرْضَى مَا رَضِيَهُ. And if the existence and the universe as it is something which is beloved to Allah, فَنَحْنُ نُحِبُّ مَا أَحَبَّهُ, then we love whatever Allah loves, and we will be pleased with whatever He is pleased with. وَقَوْلُكُمْ, and this bit here, by the way, I've highlighted, or I put this line here because this bit is missing in the translation. All of that is missing from the translation. So if you were to go to the translation, and again, I'll probably decide, maybe if you want to prove me wrong on this, please do double check just to be sure on it. It was on page of, I did highlight, there we go. So around this point here, so on page 560 of the translation, yeah, so that bit we just read, and so yeah, so that bit we've just read, this bit here. Okay, and then he jumps to what Al-Qadi Al-Baqillani raises the same questions there. So there's a bit missing between here and there. Okay, so at this point, okay, so this point, so that will go to, yeah, so وَقَوْلُكُمْ, this is another objection. إن الرضا بالقضاء يطلق جملة. As for you're saying that rida and being pleased with what Allah has decreed can be applied in generic terms. ولا يطلق تفصيلا, but we don't say that it applies to every individual thing that He has decreed. He says لا مخلص في هذا المقام فإنه وإن لم يطلق تفصيلا فذلك في جملة المرضي به فيعود الإشكال. So he said that approach is somewhat problematic. He says, Ibn Qayyim is saying that we say yes, we can say that generally speaking we are pleased with what Allah has decreed, but there might be individual things that we are not pleased with. Then he said there's no way that you can really escape from this predicament. فإنه وإن لم يطلق تفصيلا فذلك في جملة المرضي به فيعود الإشكال. Okay, so what he's saying here is, by the way, where it has in brackets the parenthesis there, that's obviously missing from a manuscript, and that's probably why it's not present in the translation. So ما بين المعقوفين سقط. So from a number of manuscripts that's not actually mentioned. فذلك في جملة المرضي به فيعود الإشكال. What he's saying here, it's not that clear. He's saying that the ishkal, or the problem here, is not really it hasn't been removed by saying that. It's not really resolving the issue. وقولكم, and as for the other argument, نرضى بها من جهة كونها خلقا لله, that we are pleased with it from the perspective that it is something that Allah has decreed and created. ونسخطها من جهة كونها كسبا للعبد, and we despise it from the perspective that it is something that the servant has earned, meaning he has basically initiated the sin. Allah has merely decreed it and allowed it to happen. فكسب العبد إن كان أمرا وجوديا فهو خلق لله فنرضى به. Then the problem with that is that whatever the servant has earned in terms of his sin, even though it's something which he has brought about into existence, it's still something that Allah has created, and therefore we are pleased with that. So basically it's still saying you're still pleased with you're pleased with a sin. So it doesn't really resolve the issue. وإن كان أمرا عدميا فلا حقيقة له وترضى ولا تسخط. And if it's something that is non-existent, it hasn't been created, then it's got no real reality, so it's not an issue to be pleased or displeased with. وأما قولكم, as for your saying نرضى بالقضاء دون المقضي, as for your saying that we are pleased with what Allah has decreed, meaning the process, the qada, دون المقضي, and not necessarily the individual thing that He has decreed. فهذا إنما يصح على قول من جعل القضاء غير المقضي. So he said this view can only be correct if you go for the view that qada is different to maqdi, which we spoke about before. The qada is the process of Allah essentially decreeing a matter, and the maqdi is the individual thing that Allah has decreed. So this view will only be valid if we make that distinction. وَالْفِعْلُ غَيْرُ الْمَفْعُولِ, and which is another way of saying that the action is different to the thing that has been acted upon. وَأَمَّا مَنْ لَمْ يُفَرِّقْ بَيْنَهُمَا, as for the one who does not distinguish between al-qada and maqdi, فَكَيْفَ يَصِحُ هَذَا عَلَى أَصْلِ, then how can it be a valid argument? Okay, so this argument will only stand if you distinguish between Allah decreeing the fact that Allah has decreed something and the actual decree itself. وقد أورد القاضي الباقلاني على نفسه هذا السؤال, and القاضي الباقلاني has basically he's posed this question to himself, where he said فإن قيل القضاء عندكم هو المقضي أو غيره. So if it said, this is he's quoting al-Baqillani, qada is qada according to you, is it the same as maqdi or is it something else? قيل هو على ضربين. So he said it's of two types. There's of two types here. فالقضاء بمعنى الخلق هو المقضي. So the qada بمعنى الخلق, I qada, I meaning by qada the creation, I bringing the thing into existence. Okay, so bringing the thing into existence is which is what Allah does. Okay, the actual thing itself. هو المقضي, that is the thing which has been decreed. لأن الخلق هو المخلوق, because creation is what has been created by Allah. والقضاء الذي هو إلزام هو الإلزام والإعلام والكتابة غير المقضي. But the qada, which is the ilzam, where Allah makes it binding, and kitaba, meaning Allah writes it or is written in the sacred tablet. So willing it to happen, allowing it to happen, that's not the maqdi, that's the qada. لأن الأمر غير المأمور, because the thing that Allah commands is different to, it's a separate entity to the thing that has been done. So for example, if I say go and pray, I've commanded you to pray, but when the person prays, that prayer is different to the command. They're two different things. One thing is a command, the other thing is an act. Yeah? So similarly, when Allah decrees a sin, okay, He has allowed it to happen, He's willed it to happen, but that's different to the sin itself. It's the sin itself that we dislike. But the fact that Allah has willed it to happen, we are content with that. والخبر غير المخبر عنه, another way of saying it as well. وهذا الجواب, he says, وهذا الجواب لا يخلصه أيضا, and this jawab basically doesn't do justice. This answer doesn't do justice to the issue at hand. لأن الكلام ليس في الإلزام والإعلام والكتابة, because the issue here is not about Allah making a particular decree binding and it being recorded in the sacred tablet. وإنما في نفس الفعل المقدر والمعلم به المكتوب, because the action, he's saying that the matter revolves, or the matter is pertaining to the actual muqaddar, the thing that will happen, and not the process of it. وهو مقدره وكاتبه ومقدره, and that is Allah. وكاتبه سبحانه راض به أم لا, is Allah pleased with it or not? وهل العبد مأمور بالرضا به نفسه أم لا, هذا حرف المسألة. So he says, what the real issue here is basically, are we commanded to be pleased with it or not as servants? That's the gist. That's the heart of the mas'ala. وقد أنكر, and so he gives his answer. So he says, وقد أنكر سبحانه على من جعل مشيئته وقضاءه مستلزمين. And so now you will see Ibn Qayyim's way of viewing this. He said Allah has condemned those who made His will and His qada mutually مستلزمين لمحبته ورضاه. He's condemned those who have made His will and His decree be things which necessitate Him loving them and being pleased with them. فكيف بمن جعل ذلك شيئا واحدا. So how can you make all of that one whole entity and one thing? Meaning, if Allah has decreed it, that means He loves it. It's the same thing. No. Look at this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سيقول الذين أشركوا, those who commit shirk, they will say, لو شاء الله ما أشركنا ولا آباؤنا ولا حرمنا من شيء. That if Allah had willed, we would not have committed shirk, nor would our forefathers committed shirk. ولا حرمنا من شيء, nor would we have made things haram upon us. Because one of the ways of the mushrikeen, that they would make certain things haram upon themselves. okay, and things that Allah had made halal, okay, which is, by the way, one of the instances, in a number of instances in the Quran where Allah condemns those who make things haram without without a justification. Okay, so often you find people, they only kick up a fuss when people make things halal. Okay, but they don't make up a fuss, or they don't make a fuss when people unrightfully make things haram as well. Whereas in the Quran, both are condemned. And in many ways, those who make things haram, that Allah did not make haram, that's even stressed more in the Quran from certain perspectives. Anyway, so this was the argument of the mushrikeen. If Allah had willed, we would not have committed shirk. كذلك كذب الذين من قبلهم حتى ذاقوا بأسنا. And so the people who came before them, they also made the same lie until they tasted our punishment. قل هل عندكم من علم فتخرجوه لنا. So say to them, do you have any knowledge, meaning any divine knowledge, that you can bring out to us to show us what you are saying is true? إن تتبعون إلا الظن وإن أنتم إلا تخرصون. That you are only following conjecture, and وَإِنْ أَنْتُمْ إِلَّا تَخْرُونَ, and you are doing nothing but guessing. So that was an argument of the mushrikeen. The mushrikeen, they said, look, they made Allah's will and love and pleasure one thing. So basically, if Allah, whatever Allah wills, that means He likes it. So Allah has willed that we are committing shirk. That must mean Allah is happy with it. But no, they're two different things. وقال تعالى, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وقال الذين أشركوا لو شاء الله ما عبدنا من دونه من شيء نحن ولا آباؤنا ولا حرمنا من دونه من شيء كذلك فعل الذين من قبلهم. They said, those who committed shirk, they said, if Allah had willed, we would not have worshipped other than Allah, nor would have our forefathers had worshipped other than worshipped Allah. ولا حرمنا من دونه من شيء, and we would not have prohibited things. كذلك فعل الذين من قبل. Those who came before. It's a similar verse. Likewise, Allah says in Surah Al-Zukhruf, وقالوا لو شاء الرحمن ما عبدناهم. They said, if the Rahman would have willed, we would not have worshipped them. ما لهم بذلك من علم. They have no knowledge of that. فهم استدلوا على محبته ورضاه لشركهم. So they cited as proof for their shirk Allah's rida and His mahabba, His love, بمشيئته لذلك, due to the fact that He willed it. So they thought, if Allah willed it, then that necessitates, يلازم يستلزم, it necessitates that Allah loves it. And if Allah loves it, who are we to go against that? وعارضوا بهذا الدليل وعارضوا بهذا الدليل أمره ونهيه. And they opposed with this evidence His command and His prohibitions. وفيه أبين الرد لقول من جعل مشيئته عين محبته ورضاه. And in this, within these verses, you'll find it's the clearest refutation for those who make His will the same thing as His love and His pleasure. They're two different things. So this answers the question, why does Allah allow evil to occur? The problem with that question is, why does Allah allow evil to occur? The problem with that question is that the questioner is assuming Allah only allows things that He likes to happen. But the reality is that that's not the case. Allah doesn't always allow good things to occur. Sometimes He allows evil things to occur. Not because He likes it, not because He finds it good and it pleases Him. No. فالإشكال إنما نشأ من جعلهم المشيئة نفس المحبة. So the problem comes, it arose from the fact that they made His mashi'a and mahabba one thing, His will and His love the same thing. ثم زادوه بجعلهم الفعل نفس المفعول. And then they, in addition to that, they made the action of Allah decreeing the same as the maf'ul, the same as the actual thing that happens, meaning the actual decree itself. So i.e. the qada and the maqdi. والقضاء عين المقضي. فنشأ من ذلك إلزامهم بكونه تعالى راضيا محبا لذلك والتزام رضاهم به. And as a result of that, they have necessitated that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased and He loves the actions that they do. وَالَّذِي يَكْشِفُ هَذِهِ الْغُمَّةِ, and the thing that really removes this cloud and this ambiguity, وَيُبْصِرُ مِنْ هَذِهِ الْعَمَايَةِ, and the thing that gives us clarity and makes us see light from this sort of blindness, وَيُنْجِي مِنْ هَذِهِ الْوَرَطَةِ, and the thing that saves us from this predicament and this confusion basically, is التفريق بين ما فرق الله بينه وهو المشيئة. It is the way out of this predicament is to distinguish between those things that Allah has differentiated. Okay, so you distinguish between those things that Allah has differentiated. وهو المشيئة والمحبة, which is to differentiate between Allah's will and Allah's love and pleasure. فليسا واحدا, they are not the same thing. ولا هما متلازمين, nor do they mutually necessitate one another. So Allah's mashi'ah, Allah's will, doesn't mean that it will that He loves it. If Allah wills for a person to commit sin, doesn't mean He loves it. Nor does it mean that if Allah loves something, it will necessarily happen. بل قد يشاء ما لا يحبه. Rather, in fact, Allah can will something that He does not love. ويحب ما لا يشاء كونه. And He could love something that He will not decree for it to happen. Okay? فالأول كمشيئة لوجود إبليس وجنوده. And the first type, i.e. Allah decreeing something that He doesn't like, is like the existence of the devil and his army. ومشيئته ومشيئته العامة لجميع ما في الكون مع بغضه لبعضه. And likewise, for the general things that Allah decrees to happen in this existence, even though He despises some of it. Okay, والثاني, and the second example is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He decrees, He likes certain things, but He won't decree it to happen. كمحبته إيمان الكافر, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loving that a disbeliever becomes a believer. Would Allah like for a disbeliever to be a believer? Of course. ولا يرضى لعباده الكفر. Allah says He doesn't like for His servants to commit kufr. وطاعات الفجار. Allah would like for the sinners to become obedient to Him. وعدل الظالمين. Allah likes to see the ظالمين be just. وتوبة الفاسقين. He likes to see the evildoers commit tawbah, make tawbah. ولو شاء ذلك لوجد كله وكان جميعه. That if Allah had willed, لوجد كله, meaning He would have, all of that would have happened. ولوجد كله وكان جميعه. كان بمعنى وجد. As you know, كان can mean وجد, and all of that would be basically. فإنه ما شاء الله كان, because whatever Allah wills, كان, it will be, it will happen. ومن لم يشأ لم يكن, and that which He does not will not occur. فإذا تقرر هذا الأصل, so if this principle is established, وأن الفعل غير المفعول, and that the action of Allah is different to the, I don't know how you translate this. وأن الفعل غير, it'd be interesting to see how he translated it. وأن الفعل غير, we've come across it before already though. وأن الفعل غير المفعول. If anyone finds a translation, maybe good to share it. وأن الفعل غير المفعول, that the action is other than the actual thing that happens. والقضاء غير المقضي, and the process of Allah decreeing something is different to the actual thing that has been decreed. وأن الله لم يأمر عباده بالرضا بكل ما خلقه وشاءه, and that Allah has not commanded that His servants be pleased with everything that He has created and willed. زالت الشبهات, then in that situation all of the doubts and confusions will be removed. وانحلت الإشكالات, and all of the ishkalat, all of the, again, the ambiguities will be removed. وَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدِ, and all praise belongs to Allah. وَلَمْ يَبْقَى بين شرع الرب وقدره تناقض, and in that situation there will be no contradiction between the law of Allah and His decree, بحيث يظن إبطال أحدهما للآخر, where that the problem where one essentially opposes the other. بل القدر ينصر الشرع, rather we say Allah's decree, it supports His shara'. والشرع يصدق القدر ويصدق القدر, and Allah's decree or Allah's law يصدق القدر, it actualizes the decree. وكل منهما يحقق الآخر, each of the two actualize one another. Okay, we've run out of time. I thought we would have covered more, but yeah, it makes sense to stop on that point. فإذا عرف هذا. Right, so Alhamdulillah, I hope this topic of, obviously there was a lot to take in today, extremely a lot to take in today, so please do go over it, inshallah. And I think by the time we finish from this, and I know a number of you still have questions in your minds about this topic, because it's a big topic and it's bigger than a lot of people think. And I hope that this is what this class has, or this is one of my objectives in the class, is to make people realize that the topics that are usually discussed relating to sabr and shukr are a lot vaster and a lot wider and a lot more encompassing than the way people perceive. And it's with this deeper understanding of these realities that we can inshallah draw closer to Allah and hopefully remove a lot of the doubtful things that are in our minds regarding these very important topics. Stephen Fry needs to join this class. SubhanAllah. A Nahwi question. La wujida kulluhu isn't here. وجد فيكون منصوبا أن يكون كله. You see, wajada is a fi'l. It can be read in a different way, because wajada it's a verb which can be lazim or muta'addi. Okay, because you have the verb awjada. Awjada means to make, to bring into existence. So you can read it wajada kullahu, like meaning he. So it can be read as wajada kullahu, which would mean that he brings it into existence. Okay, but if you treat wajada as not being lazim, then you would make it mabni lil majhul, so it become wujida kulluhu. Okay, or you can read it in that way as well. So you can read it wujida kulluhu or wajada yani huwa kullahu. You can read it in both ways. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, alhamdulillah, jazakumullah khairan everybody. We will inshallah resume next week at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanakallah bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.